Good morning and welcome to video number 3 of my sourdough series. Today I am going to talk all about sourdough starter. Remember, this is what leavens your bread, this is what rises it. You're using this instead of the conventional yeast packets. And this can be tricky for a lot of people. If you don't have a good starter, then you don't have good bread. And so this is the base of having really good homemade sourdough bread. And I'm actually going to take you along a week's journey of how I am feeding and discarding and using my starter. So you kind of get an idea of what I do on a day-to-day basis with my starter. And for starters, there are so many ways to do this. There are so many methods. There is no one way for everyone when it comes to a sourdough starter because it's just individual. Like, there are lots of ways you can do it, and it depends on your baking. If you are going to bake a lot, you'll keep this out on the counter probably all of the time. If you only bake once a week and you don't want to feed this every day, you'll keep it in the fridge. If you want to build up your discard pile so that you can bake with discard, you'll feed this maybe a little bit differently. But if you don't care to have discard, then you can feed this a small amount and only when you use it. And so, like I said, there's so many ways to do it. And as you get into your sourdough journey, you will find what works best for you. Now, when you feed this, there are people who just use 1/4 of a measuring cup or they eyeball it with a spoon or however they do it, and that's totally fine. I think having a scale, first of all, when you're making bread, I think a scale is very necessary, and we'll talk about tools in another video. But when it comes to your starter, you don't necessarily have to have a scale, but I like using it because there's less dishes, there's no eyeballing it, there's no guessing. It just makes it really easy, and so I like using a scale to weigh. This is the jar I typically keep it in. I don't do the 2-jar method when I feed it, and I'll show you what I mean, but it gets kind of dirty and grimy, and that's totally fine. That's normal. Don't look at it and be like, ew, Julie, your jar is gross. But you know, it does look kind of gross, but that can be normal, that's fine. But it is kind of gross today, so I'm going to be putting it in a new jar. Now, the very first thing that I suggest you do is, well, you find a jar, and I like one that has a wide mouth. Mason jars work, but they're pretty narrow on the top, and so I think they're hard to like get in, and they can get stuck along the neck of those mason jars. These are wet jars. These are really common in the sourdough world. An old pickle jar, an old peanut butter jar, any kind of jar, just find a jar will work. And then the next thing I suggest doing is weighing your jar empty. So on this little note, I have my jars, the 2 different sizes that I use and how much they weigh. So for instance, if I want to know how much starter is in my jar right now, I'm just going to weigh that, and it's 382 grams, but I know my jar weighs 293 grams. So 382 minus 293, what is that? 91, 92, something like that. There's like 90 grams of starter in here. So I don't keep a lot of it on hand. So I've got my scale. I'm going to put my empty jar, and I'm going to zero that out. And I am going to add about 25 grams of starter. You can see this is very flat, very runny, which means it is hungry. It is more acidic. It might have maybe an acetone or an alcohol-y smell. That also means it's hungry. This would not make very good bread. It wouldn't rise very well. This does not have to be perfect. I ended up doing 35 grams, 34 grams, which is totally fine. So I'm going to zero that out. Now, a lot of people do even parts starter, water, and flour. I like to do more water and flour per starter. So I'm just going to do 50 grams of water. I like to do the water first so that I can kind of mix it up before I add the flour. I think it makes adding the flour or incorporating it a little bit easier. You can do all-purpose flour, you can do bread flour. I think I did 51. Okay, well I just dumped 61 in there, so I'm just gonna scoop a little bit out. You want to mix this up pretty good. You don't really want a lot of lumps in there. You want it to be pretty smooth. I don't think you can over mix it. In fact, the more you mix it, the more you're activating the microbes. And I like using a little spatula because you can scrape down the sides of your jar. And there you have it. If you want to put a rubber band on your jar right there and then watch it double or grow, you can do that. I don't always do that. Sometimes I do, but not all the time. You can see it's pretty thick in there. It's not super runny. Now, when it comes to reading your sourdough starter and watching it double up and rise and get to like the optimal level of baking width at peak, they call it at peak, there are lots of variables. It depends on the humidity of your environment, how warm your kitchen is. If you are in a warm, humid environment, this is going to rise a lot quicker. If it's cold and not as humid, it will take slower for this to rise. If I added a lot of flour to this and I made it more of a stiff starter and it was really thick, it would also take a longer time to rise. And so that comes into play if you are doing this at night and you don't want it to rise and then fall back down, because once it rises, it stays there for a while and then it'll fall back down. And if you don't want that to happen throughout the night because you want to wake up and bake with it, then you could add more flour to it, make it a little bit stiffer so it takes longer to eat through all of that flour. I'm going to go ahead and put a rubber band on my jar so we can see how long it takes to double. It's about noon here. What am I going to do with all this extra starter that was in this jar? This is now going to become discard, and this is what I keep in my refrigerator. This is what I add to waffles and pancakes and so many things. So I am just going to take all of the contents in this jar and pour it into my discard pile. This is going to go in the fridge. Now, if for any reason something were to happen to this, it were to fall and crash and break or who knows what, I can reactivate this. I'll just stick it in the fridge, and if I wanted starter and I didn't have any, I could take a scoop of this and add flour and water, and I can get it reactivated up and make it into active sourdough starter. So, I mean, it's all the same thing. It just depends on what stage it's at. So, fridge, countertop. Now it is time to wash this out. You do not want to put sourdough down your kitchen sink. You will clog your pipes. You can see how hard and dry this gets on the jar. It's extremely hard to get off, which I should probably have swapped out to a newer jar earlier. But you don't want to put this down the sink because you will ruin your kitchen pipes. So I get as much of it as I can, either use a paper towel to just wipe this off into the garbage can, and then I'm just gonna let this soak for a while before I try and clean it out so it's not as hard to clean. It's 8 o'clock in the evening, so it's taken about 8 hours for my starter to rise and become active. This is what it looks like when it is completely at peak. You can see there's kind of like a round dome on the top. It absolutely looks perfect. I can either start making a dough, use it to bake with right now, or I can put it in the fridge and use it in the morning. I am actually just going to leave it on the countertop. I love doing that. I don't feel like doing anything with it, so I'm just going to leave it on the countertop and deal with it in the morning. All right, it is noon the next day, which means it's been a total of 24 hours since I fed my starter, and since 8 o'clock last night, remember how it was high and beautiful? It has fallen back down, which means it is time to feed it again. So if I were to not discard and leave that much in there, I would need to feed at least that same amount in flour and water. And so if you don't discard, you're always going to end up with more and more and more, and you're going to have to feed it more and more and more. So you can see how that's going to grow exponentially. So I've got my discard jar here, and I am just going to pour this into here. Earlier, when I fed it, I did the 2-jar method where I had a clean jar and I put a little bit of starter into that and then just discarded all of the rest. This time I'm still going to use my same jar. Now I just eyeball it. That looks about a little bit more than a tablespoon. I always eyeball it. However, if you don't like to eyeball things and you want to be precise, let's go ahead and measure it. I know that this jar right here weighs 390 grams. 425 grams. That means there's 35 grams of starter in my jar, which is just fine. I know I want to make a bread recipe that calls for 60 grams of starter, so I need at least 30 grams flour, 30 grams water to make my 60 grams of starter, but I also want a little extra to keep my starter growing. So I am going to do just 50 grams of each. What I am just realizing is it is noon and it's kind of a warm day. If I do this, it will be ready to go by 6 o'clock tonight, but I don't want to make bread until later this evening, like right before I go to bed. So I'm actually going to add some more flour to make it a little bit stiffer, and that will give it more to eat, which means it'll take longer for it to get to peak. And so it kind of gives me flexibility on when I can use it. Or I guess I could put it in the fridge for a couple hours if I needed to. Either one would work just fine. You can see that is a lot more stiff. That will take a little bit longer to feed. I'm just going to move my rubber band up just a little bit. And tonight I will make bread with it. It is about 10 o'clock in the evening, about 10 hours after I fed this, and look how happy and ready this is to bake with. It has grown that much. This is at peak. I am going to start a loaf of sandwich bread, and so I wanted to start it late in the evening so that by about 8 o'clock in the morning I can shape it. I only need about 65 grams. You can see it is very thick. Okay, it's a little bit more, 75, but that's fine too. Okay, I know so many people say after you use your starter in a recipe, don't forget to feed your starter. Well, I'm here to say you don't have to if you don't want to. So honestly, I'm just gonna leave it the way it is. I'm just going to sit it on my countertop, and in the morning, I will probably feed it because I don't need happy fed starter in the morning because I have nothing to do with it in the morning. So I'm just going to put the lid back on it. Most of it's, I mean, there's still just a little bit in there, and I'm just going to leave it on my counter through the nighttime, and I guarantee you by morning time it will be flat and runny again. Good morning. It has actually been a while since I have last filmed. In fact, the big jar that I showed you last has broken since I have filmed, but I'm just going to start back from where I left off. I used my starter last night, and after I used a scoop, I just used like a scoop of it to create 11. Here is an analogy that I have heard. Pretend that this is a bunch of teenage boys and you want to feed them 50 grams flour, 50 grams water. That's 100 grams total. Well, that's not going to be enough food for all of these teenage boys because there's a lot of them in here. But if I scoop out a lot of these teenage boys and toss them aside and then feed just the few boys that are left the same amount of flour and water, the 100 grams, then that's more food for them. They don't have to share it, and they are going to be happy, and they are going to be full, and they're going to grow and get bubbly. And you just want a small amount in here. I'm going to scoop a lot of this flat starter into my discard jar. I don't need a lot, just a big spoonful worth, 1 to 2 tablespoons. That's probably even more than I need, but we'll just go with it. I'm gonna leave that out on the countertop. Yes, it is the same day. I had to change my shirt because I got it dirty. It's been about 4 hours, and I want to show you how happy this is. There's like almost like a pillowy round top. This is peak. This you could cook with. So I can either cook with this, I can leave it on my counter and let it fall back down flat and then save it as discard, or I can put it in my fridge. So I'm gonna put it in my fridge and try baking with it in a couple days. Good morning. It has been about 5 or 6 days since I put my starter in the refrigerator, and this is what it looks like now. You can see it has fallen a little bit, but I'm going to try and bake with it anyway. I'm just going to bake straight with this, see if it makes a loaf of bread, and we'll go from there. Now what I am going to show you is another way to maintain your starter, because I want to show you that there's no one way, no one right way. And so instead of feeding this, I am just going to put this back into the refrigerator like this. And when I pull it out next and I'm ready to bake with it, then I will feed it. So I just scooped a bunch of it out, and I'm going to put it straight in the fridge. This way, if you don't want to maintain a lot of discard, if If you don't want to bake every day, there's lots of ways around it. So I'm just gonna pop it in the fridge like this. Worked like a charm. Look at that. That rose up beautiful with a starter that sat in the fridge for 6 days. It has been a very long time since I have fed my starter. So I fed it, put it in the fridge for 5 days, took it out, used it, and then put it straight back into the fridge without feeding it. So it's been a long time since I have fed it. And when you do that, you might have to feed it a few times before it becomes super active and bubbly. So this is all I have left. You see that? All right, so I just fed this cold starter. A lot of people get hung up on whether or not you should let your starter come to room temperature before you use it, or before you feed it, or before you put it back in the fridge or whatnot. And I don't think it matters. Don't get hung up on that. Just pull it out and use it when you want. So don't let that be a concern to you. I don't think it should be. So we are going to get this active again because it has been dormant for quite some time. I forgot to show my starter when it was at peak last night. It has been 16 hours, but you can see that it came back to life and is doing very well. So these are very resilient. You can go quite a while without feeding them in the fridge. You can just pull it out and it's very flexible, can work with your time schedule. Don't be afraid of having a starter and keeping it alive. The only way you have killed your starter is if there's mold on it. So a lot of people think that their starter has died because it's liquidy and runny, but really if there's mold on it, then that's a no-go. But other than that, they are very easy to come back to being active and happy. So just keep at it, and guys, that is my starter video for you.